Everyone, welcome once again to Cave Across Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're just in the preliminary arguments in our The Great Debate book, which is also based on The Great Debate that was done by Greg Bahnsen and Gordon Stein back in the 80s. And this kind of put both Bahnsen and presuppositionalism argumentation on the map. This is pretty much well regarded by those in our camp that want to point to a good exchange. There have been probably even better exchanges since then, but this is kind of the grandfather movement for other people that have taken and run with this type of argumentation. And so we have a book here, which is essentially a transcript of the debate because the debate wasn't filmed. There's an audio recording. It was a very poor audio recording back in the day, passed around probably like the original Fantastic Four movie that was scalped by people and shared and reshared on audio cassettes. And the loss of generation is way different from tape to tape versus MP3 to MP3. But people have gone and cleaned it up some. And so all the links for the audio recording are below. I have a video audio recording that someone has posted with the transcript to help you follow along if you want to do that. I've linked to the Bahnsen Institute, which has compiled a lot of I think, the entire catalog of Greg Bahnsen's debates and lectures and a whole slew of items that are beneficial. In fact, he has a critique on one of the book presentations that we did with one of our previous books that I used in my discussion with Eli Alla on Revealed Apologetics. And so that's a good source of information if you want to check out way more of Greg Bahnsen's stuff. But here we're...
That's Frame, right? Was that Frame?
Right, John Frame. Yep, I should mention that. And so it was a well-regarded critique of the critique, and it was very helpful to go through it. So I highly recommend that group. And then I think they link essentially to the catalog on the sermon audio, which is where I got a lot of my resources from that as well. But,
yeah, and I would really encourage folks to listening to us to listen to this debate. It comes across, it is just really a good listen with regard to debates. And I think you'll get more out of the book that we're going through if you've listened to the debate beforehand. So I would encourage folks to listen to the debate.
Yeah, and I would almost say probably go through the book first and get a sense of the actual argumentation, because how we write, and people know this from, at least they knew back in the day before Twitter and the social media craze of having to throw up all your knowledge on everything at once within 12 seconds of reading about it. But you're able to kind of take it in, you're able to backspace and delete and take a breath and say, is this essentially how I want to sound in print form? And so they don't have the privilege of that, but we have the privilege of reading in that type of way where we can say, oh, hold on, I didn't quite get what he was saying, back up and follow through from there. But then when you listen to the rhetoric portion of it, things change. The reaction to the audience is in there as well, because the mic quality isn't the best, so it picks up a lot of the audience as well.
Even though they didn't want the audience to say a whole...
it is poor form. It's kind of like jeering during an orchestra concert too. So, but there's some quality highlights in doing that as well. So all that to say, this has been edited and commented by Joshua Pillows, and the link to this book is through American Vision, and that's also in the links below or on cavetothecross.com, where we've linked everything as well. So what we've initially done so far is we've given Greg Bahnsen's opening. It was a unique opening, kind of not one that you're used to. First of all, in a debate, you tend to want to present your case and then hit all the points that you want possible. Maybe work on some, this is what my opponent will attempt to say, but let me head him off at the pass a little bit. But what Bahnsen has done here is he's presented very quickly a case against the positions that Stein is bringing forth to kind of lay the foundation for the debate itself. And then initially his entire argumentation for why we know does God exist is the very fact that the debate is happening and is coherent and things are being argued for, and there's a moral case, there's a logic case, and there's the preconditions of intelligibility that are baked into the debate, and those are baked into the universe, and those are baked in by the baker, the master baker, which is God. So it's a unique one, and we've laid out his opening statement. And again, if you look at the table of contents, this isn't our kind of normal debate where you have your opening debates and your rebuttals, and then the interactions. You have kind of two different opening debates and arguments and some back and forth in between as well. So
the other thing with our presentation is, so Joshua Pillows makes commentary with regard to the debate as he has written it out here. And so we're going to try to weave those comments in. So we're going to give you in this second chapter what Stein has to say. And then also we're going to weave in the comments that Pillows makes with regard to that, so that there's no confusion. We'll try to make sure you understand the difference between, what Stein says and the comments that Joshua Pillows is making.
Right. And we want to give deference to Joshua as well, because he is a smart cookie. I've seen him on a number of interviews before, and for a layman, he knows the subject quite well. So that's not to take anything away from him. Okay, so we're essentially, I guess, kind of on our chapter 2, which is Dr. Stein's opening statement. And so he starts off by being cordial, and then maybe not so much cordial, where he says that he likes to thank Dr. Bahnsen for showing up, but also showing us that he doesn't really understand too much about atheism, but he's going to be magnanimous and that he'll attempt to straighten him out, as he says. He goes on to say that now Dr. Bahnsen repeated for me that the existence of God is a factual question, and he doesn't dispute that, but he thinks that Bahnsen has misunderstood what he said when he said that we solve factual questions in the same way. He didn't mean exactly in the same way. He means through the use of reason, logic, and evidence.
All right. So he's kind of cleared that up, right? His basis is reason, logic, and evidence. So not, looking in the pantry for crackers. And I think that's what he's responding to, right? The crackers in the pantry fallacy that Bahnsen slammed them with here. So, all right. Then next, Stein does two things. He wants to define his terms. So he's going to define atheism, and then he's going to define God and his view of these things. So first, defining atheism. He says, let me make sure what atheism is and is not. And so he tells us that he thinks it's a very common, misunderstood subject. Well, it doesn't. I guess you could say that, right? I don't understand atheism. Well, what is it that you don't understand, right? But he says, notice, atheists do not say that they can prove that there is no God, right? So what he's doing is, in defining atheism, he's trying to establish the terms of the debate, right? That's what he's trying to establish. And again, he's trying to also push the burden of proof away from himself and on to Bahnsen. Is really what he's trying to do here. So he says, atheists do not say that they can prove that there is no God. So he's not going to try and prove that there's no God. An atheist, he says, is not someone who denies that there is a God. Rather, an atheist says that he has examined the proofs that are offered by the theist, and he finds them inadequate. Okay, so, he's going to give us 11 of these as he's examined. I can remember a book that Plantica put together, and at the very end of it, at the end of the book, he gave like 26 arguments for the existence of God. Well, Stein's going to deal with 11 arguments, so I'm not sure how thorough he's examined all the arguments, right? And clearly, he doesn't examine Bahnsen's argument, right? He misses Bahnsen's whole argument in these 11 that he's going to give us. But anyway, he says an atheist is a person that has examined the proofs that are offered by the theist, and he finds them inadequate. And so an atheist is really someone who is without a belief in God, or who does not have belief in a God. He tells us it's not someone who denies the existence of God, or who says that one does not exist, or can prove that God does not exist. He says, so that's not what he's trying to do. He's just trying to show that the proofs that theists offer are inadequate. So he gives himself a really low bar, right, to try to get over, right? And so again, he's trying to push the burden of proof here onto Bahnsen.
Right. Makes it easier for him, too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then we move on to his definition of God. And he says that he heard Bahnsen's definition of God, but he says that he'd like to define God as well. I'm not so sure I like his definition, speaking of Bahnsen. He goes on to say that I'm not going to stick to just the Christian God. I'm going to stick to all kinds of gods. Okay.
So this I had a problem with this initially.
Of course.
Because now he's saying, it's almost, you could almost, accusing him of building a straw man here.
100%.
Bahnsen saying, here's a specific this is the Christian God that I'm talking about. Well, I'm not going to deal with your argument. I'm going to defeat a different argument, and I'm going to talk about a different kind of God. Okay, fine. But here's the issue. Let's say that you win the argument with regard to your definition of God. You still haven't touched Bahnsen's, position. And so, it's almost a straw man here. But anyway.
Yeah, well, and he's allowed to kind of shotgun approach all theists. And this seems like a presentation that he would give to like a general theism or an all theist crowd. But it's weird when you're debating a Presbyterian biblical Christian who's going to posit all the qualities of what God means within that. And so we'll go on to give his definition here, but this seems like an overly too low bar for God. It seems like you'd want all the qualities baked in, especially where we know Bahnsen's going to be going here. But where does he pull this definition from? He tells us first that he's going to use the definition which both Father Copleston and Bertrand Russell both agreed on their famous debate. So, it's that never refer to a better movie within your movie. So this is the great debate. So it's referring to another great debate here. And so this is his definition of what he defines as God. He's going to define it as a supreme personal being distinct from the world and creator of the world. Okay, there are elements of that, right, that fit the biblical Christian God, but that leaves out a lot of different parts, especially the triune nature of God that Bahnsen's going to definitely focus in on as well.
All right, good. So there's his definition of God. So he's defined what atheism is, and he's kind of given us a definition of God. Now he's going to jump into his review of the various proofs that he wants to attempt to defeat, right? He says, okay, now throughout history, 11 major kinds of evidences or proofs have been offered for the existence of God. Okay, so just 11? I mean, come on, really? But anyway, that's where he starts off with, right? And so he wants to deal with these. If these 11 proofs do not work out logically, he tells us, or lead to logical self-contradictions, then we can only say that God's existence is not proved. Well, we can say that God's existence is not proved by these 11, right? That's probably the most we can say, right? And so he goes on to say, we can say that God's existence is not proved, it's unproven, not disproven, as he mentioned before. So it's not, he's making this distinction. He's not trying to say that God doesn't exist. He's just trying to say that the existence of God is unproven by these 11 arguments. All right. So he says you cannot prove that something, does not exist. And he understands that. That's why he makes the bar low, right? You can't prove a negative, right? And that's why he mentioned before, he tells us the definition of an atheist is not someone who thinks he has proven that God does not exist, because you can't do that. All right. So there he goes. That's how. So he's going to jump into these various 11 proofs, and he's going to try to show that they don't work, right? That they don't prove God's existence.
And as we're going through this episode and probably next episode, just put yourself into the mindset of remembering what happened that Bahnsen was presenting in his opening statement, and see if any of these things tend to match up, and whether or not Stein understands who he's talking to and what his opponent is, or if he's just bloviating here. Well, the first one he's going to tackle is the cosmological argument. Probably well known to us, the first cause, the first mover, the Kalam argument. This tends to be kind of in the tool belt very quickly for the classical apologist. And so he says that the first cause argument, also called the cosmological argument, says that everything must have a cause. Therefore, the universe had a cause, and that cause is God. God was the first or uncaused cause, right? So all things that exist, I'm putting his own spin on this, had a cause. The universe exists, therefore the universe had a cause. Who was that causer? It was God, and so now he's going to attack it. And so he's going to have a problem with this. Okay, so this leads us to a real logical bind, he says, for the theist, because everything must have had a cause, right? Everything. Well, then God must have had a cause. Well, and if God had a cause, then he was not the first or uncaused cause. If God did not have a cause, then not everything must have a cause. If not everything needs a cause, then perhaps the universe is one of those things which doesn't need a cause. So there's kind of two levels of argumentation here. So the first one being is that the idea that if all things had a cause that caused things, then God himself must be caused by something. You're going to want to stop here, right? You're going to want to throw your flag on the play and say that's not the type of God that's existed within the confines of the historicity of the New Testament church, Scripture, the Old Testament, so all those things.
And again, this gets back to his definition of God, right?
Exactly.
This broad definition, then he can use this type of thing to help, criticize the existence of God.
Right.
But if you have a different definition of God, this argument doesn't work, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And so, okay, well then what about Zeus? Zeus doesn't fit this definition, but he has to argue against Zeus. So this cosmological argument doesn't fit either. Or I guess it's not Zeus, it's his father. But regardless of the fact that there seems to be a movement here which is arguing for a type of God that isn't believed, and we'd want to stop this. And again, just imagine yourself in Bahnsen's position and seeing what his responses will be to these things. Okay, so what he summarizes here is that so if God can be a caused being that causes the universe, well then maybe the universe is one of those things which also doesn't need a cause as well. So he's saying essentially that if your God is also caused logically, if you want to take this form of argumentation, then the universe is caused. And if he's not caused, well, then maybe the universe is also uncaused. And so you've got yourself, he says, into a logic bind there, and that proof basically fails, as if to shirk off this thing as completely finito and done with, even though we'd want to argue with a few of the premises here.
Right. In fact, so the next part here is, Joshua Pillow's comment on Bahnsen's, take on the cosmological argument. And he really makes two...
Stein's.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Stein's cosmological argument. Thank you. Yeah. He makes 2 points here with regard to Stein's argument. First, obviously, the one that we were suggesting, the nature of God. But second, also the nature of the universe, right? I mean, notice Stein tries to say perhaps the universe is one of those things which doesn't need a cause. Really? Are you really going to say that, right? And so this is what Joshua Pillows has to say. He says, apart from considerations pertaining to this argument broadly, this would be a blatant category error regarding the Christian God, right? Again, Stein has kind of defined the type of God that he's going to attack, but this particular argument doesn't deal with the Christian God, right? Why? Well, Pillows tells us that the Christian God is both self-existing, and not dependent on something else for his existence. And so the Christian God has necessary existence, absolute and eternal in all of his nature, right? So notice the problem here is that you can't just say, the Christian God was created if everything had a cause, right? Notice, so that's the first thing. Christian God doesn't have a cause, and no Christian would say, God was caused by something.
Right.
He doesn't believe that, and neither does Bahnsen. Neither of them believe that God was. So again, this is kind of a straw man type of, thing. No Christian believes that God was caused, right? God is eternal. He has necessary existence. He's self-existent. He's not dependent on anything else for his existence. So that's the first point. Secondly, the nature of the universe. The universe, Pillow tells us, is by definition contingent, right? So it's not, perhaps one of these things that doesn't need a cause. No, it's contingent. That is not having to have existed necessarily, right? It's dependent on something else for its existence. That's the nature of the universe, right? And therefore it needs a cause, which leads to the alternative premise that Stein doesn't give us, right? Stein says, if everything, needs a cause, then God needs a cause. That's basically what he's saying. The argument, at least the way the Kalam argument is put together by, let's see, who's our good classical friend there?
Oh, William Lane Craig?
Yeah, William Lane Craig. Yeah. That's not the premise that he uses about the argument. He says everything that begins to exist must have a cause. So that's a totally different premise, and now that's a different kind of argument, right, than what Stein is telling us that the cosmological argument gives us. Yeah. So notice, if everything that begins to exist must have a cause, we can now say that God, the Christian God, never began to exist, right? The universe we would argue then is the second premise in the argument, began to exist. And therefore, now we have to show that that premise too is indeed the case, right? And so Stein, again, kind of, I think, misrepresents the argument here, right? Because of his thinking about his definition of God, right? That definition of God now has led him astray in terms of how this particular argument works. Now, I'm not going to say that, this argument is, foolproof and it has no problems and that kind of stuff. In fact, Bahnsen doesn't even support this argument. But Stein hasn't given us the best version of this argument, all right? And I think it's based, either he deliberately didn't do it, or it's based on his, misunderstanding of who the Christian God is. I think that's
well, and then just his understanding of the universe. I mean, this is 1985, right? So this isn't 1930s with the solid state model. The redshift has been discovered and found. The Big Bang
background radiation has been detected. Yeah. So all of these types of things show that the universe at least began to exist.
Right. Exactly. So this is a weird way to dunk on your opponent here.
Yeah.
All right, well, further commentary by Pillows, he goes on to say here that there are so many fallacies in the cosmological argument, it's incredible.
Okay, so this is important, right? Now, notice as we suggested, even though Stein has given us a bad, kind of version of this argument, even if we use a better argument, Pillows is suggesting the argument still doesn't work. So it's not like he's trying to defend the argument, right? Stein gives us a bad version of the argument. Even if we have a good version of the argument, Pillows is suggesting it probably doesn't work. And so, right? So why? Why doesn't it work?
Yeah. So he has three types of argumentations against the argument itself. First off is that it begs the question. So he asks the question, can I generalize from many observations that events have causes to all events that have causes? And he says, no, this is a fallacy. Now, it may work out in our minds. We may kind of grant the fact. But if we're talking logically with good premise and conclusions and, a sound doctrine within there, to coin a phrase, then this would be kind of begging the question and not getting to where we want to be for the full bite of it.
And really, this is the problem of induction, basically. Right. Sure. Right. I observed this, there's therefore everything is like that. Well, no, just the things that you observe may be like that. Right. Can't say everything is like that.
Exactly. Which the problem of induction will definitely come up again for our atheist friends. How about the fallacy of composition? So he says, now if causation is a universal principle, can I say that because each event has a singular cause, that all events together have a singular cause? And he says no, so it's another logical fallacy. So it's not this piecemeal able to say then that all of those events together have a cause. And then the final issue that he has is with equivocation. Can I argue from what I know in my natural experience acts as a foundation for what must be true of the supernatural? Again, no. Our premises would mean one thing, and our conclusions would mean another thing when we talk about causes, because we're talking about two different realms there.
Right. And so he's suggesting that even if you clean up the argument that Pillows is telling us, that he still thinks that there's problems with this argument, right? So do we give that one to Stein? I don't know. I think Stein so, befuddled the argument that we shouldn't even give it to him. But anyway, Pillows wants to say, this is, this is not a good argument for at least the existence of how the argument is put together. Is what he suggests. All right. The second of his 11. And this is Stein's 11, right? And so this is the design or teleological argument. So it says the second one is the design argument. It's also called the teleological argument. It says that the universe is wonderful and exhibits evidence of design or order. Things which show such wonderful design must have had a designer who is even more wonderful. And of course, that designer was God. So there is Stein's take on the design argument or the teleological argument. Now, what's his problem with this argument? He says, well, if the universe is wonderfully designed, surely God is more wonderfully designed, and he must therefore have had a designer even more wonderful than himself. And again, he gets into the same issue, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of having an eternal, God who is, infinite in all of his ways and that sort of thing, he wants us to have a designed God, right? He says if God did not require a designer, all right, then there's no reason why that such a relatively less wonderful thing as the universe, notice, needed one. Again, we're into a logical self-contradiction. So if God doesn't require a designer, then why would the universe require a designer, right? Well, again, I think we have a category mistake, right? There again, God is a whole different kind of being than the natural world, right? In terms of how we view things. But anyway, Pillows doesn't really comment on all of these, by the way. Right. He comments on some of them. And so this one, he kind of lets go with regard to, I think, his comments on this.
Right. But, you have the painting in the forest, and it's a beautiful painting. So you just go, well, it just exists in and of itself. There's no need for a more beautiful painter that paints those things. So we just, Stein would be A-okay by saying that the paint dripped from the trees and made a beautiful painting of the forest around itself. And so, these type of argumentations are juvenile. And he's supposed to be the guy of atheism in 1985, right? So, definitely take a look at the book and go through the transcripts of the arguments here, because obviously we can't present everything, or we just would be reading the book. And not only is that not as fun, but it's illegal, and we don't do illegal things here. Says my lawyer. So, all right. So the third one then is the argument from life itself. The argument from life says that life cannot originate from random movements of atoms, yet life exists. Therefore, the existence of a God was necessary to create your life, right? So life is so complex. It's again harking back to the teleological, the kind of offshoot. It's my painting example. The paint doesn't drip from the trees randomly out of nowhere and gets on this canvas that was honed from the cotton that just happened to coalesce into the canvas, and then a person comes upon it and can demean order from it, right? So all these things have to happen. So rained on the rocks for millions of years, lightning struck it, and all of a sudden you had the primordial goo go from no cell to single cell to then multi-cell to then the fish, and then the fish had to find another fish to have other fishes with, and then so on and so forth. So, all these things are random movements of atoms, and he's saying that the argument from life says that that's not possible. Well, what's his issue with this? He says, well, basically life didn't originate from random movements of atoms. And no scientist would say so, because there are limits to the chemical compositions and physics of atoms, and they don't move in any possible way. Chemicals do not combine in any possible way. Again, I don't know if a double straw man is able to be put out, but I think this is a recorded case of a double straw man here. Here's
so created a new.
No one would say this.
Good for you. Yeah.
So it's an interesting way to argue, as you're not even arguing with yourself. You're making someone's argument for them and then getting mad at them, and then no one argues that way. Well, there's probably a reason no one argues that way, right? So he goes on to say then for his conclusion, so it's possible to explain the origin of life without a God. Okay, do so using the principles of parsimony or Occam's razor. I think we are all left with a simpler explanation as of the one without a God. So again, you don't need a painter to paint a painting. You just remove the painter and you have just it existing. The blues and the reds and the green all combine in a certain way. They can't combine to form other things. We know this. And so therefore a painter isn't necessary.
Right.
Okay.
So Pillows does comment on this one, right? And again, he slams him with regard to the inductive principle, right? Right. Basically, he says, how do you know what atoms did, thousands of years ago? You're just assuming based on that, right? So he says, Dr. Stein fails to take into account the lack of justification for the inductive principle. How does Stein know that until 15,000 years ago or so, atoms really could have done anything and everything based on the laws of science, differing from how we understand them today, right? Just because this is the way we understand them today doesn't mean that necessarily you can go back 15,000 years or whatever and say they've always done this. Well, no, they do it now, but how do we know things weren't different? In fact, many, cosmologists suggest that the universe may have been different at the beginning than we have today, right? Clearly it was, right? Although, the latest pictures that we've gotten as we go further and further out doesn't seem to support that. And we don't have time to get into that, but apparently the latest view as we go further and further out in terms of our ability to see the universe, scientists expected to see newly forming, galaxies. Right. And what they found was galaxies pretty much the same way they are right now, which kind of confirms creation, right? That there wasn't just, these galaxies that put themselves together or whatever. No, they were already there the way they are right now. But anyway, we won't go too far into that. I think our good friend Jason Lyle has a video out on that. And so folks can take a look at that. He predicted that what they would find is what they found.
Wait, I was told creation science can't make predictions on that.
Yeah. He predicted months when they first did this. Months before they found that's what they were going to find because God created the heavens and the earth. And so we would expect that what they would find was basically what we see today. But anyway, Stein, he says, fails to account for the lack of the justification for inductive principle. And he says, either way, life began with intentionality, intended creation, or non-intentionality, purely naturalistic processes apart from a higher being. And so as long as there's no mind ordering and ordaining and directing life, then the only alternative is nothing consciously directing it. And thus, we have this unguided chance, random process that perhaps the chemicals could do anything. And so Stein may or may not be right with that claim. That's the idea that Pillows is getting at here.
I mean, we only have, 115 different types of atomic structures in the universe. You would think that there'd be a few more carbons and hydrogen molecules that combine to form new life, and we should see this permeated throughout the entire galaxy, let alone all the other galaxies, let alone across the entire universe. So it seems odd that we're not finding these new lives continuously springing up even within our own perfect planet, but that's not the case. All right, well, I think that's good enough for us. So we've gotten through 3 of them. They go a little bit quicker. Hopefully we'll go a little bit quicker for Dr. Stein's 11 different types of arguments against a generic version of God. And so hopefully this will come out and you'll have had the book or have access to the debate itself. It's pretty much everywhere. It's available to be used. And again, the Bahnsen Institute have cleaned up a lot of the items too as best they can. So we definitely appreciate their work there as well. So cavetothecross.com. By the time this episode comes out, you should be able to go to the middle of the page and click on the book and then see all the back issues of this book. So you can start with us on day 1 and go through. So join us next time as we finish up Dr. Stein's opening statement. And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.